There was a loudspeaker. Every morning and every afternoon we had an English broadcast.
The prisoners of war, whose release had become a crucial part of the peace negotiations, were scolded about the bombings by their captors.
And Hanoi Hannah said, how can the United States continue with their bellicose and obdurate policies, bombing and strafing innocent women and children, churches, hospitals? How can they do all that after they've placed a plaque on the moon saying we come in peace for all mankind? And everyone said, on the moon? And that was the first we knew about our moon landing. There were cheers all the way through the camp. After that, we'd point to the guards would come up and we'd point to the moon, and say, U.S., U.S.
For some prisoners of war, it was their 7th Christmas in captivity. At the end of 1972, there was still no guarantee that they'd ever get home. The end of America's longest war was met with no celebration in Times Square. No honking of horns on Main Street, USA. The day the peace agreement in Vietnam was signed went by like any other.
People were prospering, the economy was booming, and most of the people didn't give a damn about Vietnam, whatever they say now. They really didn't. It was very despairing. They were very rough years coming back from that war for most vets.
I didn't feel like I fit or something. I wasn't the same person, that's for sure. I didn't feel like a civilian. It's hard to explain. I was very uncomfortable coming home. Very uncomfortable.
I'm on a civilian plane. I'm flying from Los Angeles to Newark nonstop. And a gentleman sat down. He was in a 3-piece suit. And he had a briefcase, and he kind of flipped down his tray, and he was going through his briefcase. And we made small talk before we took off. Marine, I see that, and where are you coming from? I told him Vietnam. And as soon as the sign came on that you were free to move around the cabin, he pushed the button for the stewardess. She came, and he looked up at her, and she said, can I help you? And he said, yes, I need another seat on this airplane as far away from this gentleman as I can get.
Returning vets often felt they represented a war that Americans wanted to forget. But if there was one moment that felt like a victory, it was the return of the American POWs.
So we thought, well, maybe you get your name in the paper, but nothing like that it was. People everywhere we went that didn't know us, we didn't know them, outpourings of emotion and feelings, tears. It was just overwhelming, it really was. President Nixon invited us to the White House for a party, a dinner and everything.
So many believe we never could win. Our choices were grim, but you had faith in him.
There was a lot of celebrities, and I remember John Wayne was there, so we were walking around talking with the Duke, it was pretty cool.
You're the best we have, and I'll ride off into the sunset with you anytime.
It was a grand time. It was fun, a lot of fun.
Faith and loyalty to our cause, America, and the
It was the Nixon presidency at its peak. He had ended the war with honor, and the POWs were there at the White House. And Nixon was at 70%. It was really the apex, I think, of the Nixon administration. And within a month, of course, the Watergate thing ruptured and broke.
The crisis in Vietnam would soon be replaced by a new crisis at home. A growing scandal stemming from a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the office complex known as Watergate. Hearings on Watergate dragged one White House aide after another in front of Congress to answer questions about systematic wrongdoing in the highest office in the land.
Watergate was certainly a fascinating spectacle. Suddenly, all the bad things the left had been saying throughout the Vietnam protests seemed to be proven true in spades.
Mr. Butterfield, will you stand?
The televised hearings drew in an enormous audience.
You swear the evidence that you shall give.
This was the first time the American people had ever heard that a president of the United States did things like that. But I guarantee you, he knew what the predecessors had done. It didn't all start with Watergate. There was ample precedent for everything that Nixon did. Nixon got caught.
There was one outrageous charge after another, break-ins, spying on anti-war activists, punishing political enemies.
In all of the millions of words of testimony, there is not the slightest suggestion that I had any knowledge of the planning for the Watergate break-in.
Congressional committees and their battery of lawyers were bringing the charges closer to the Oval Office. One of the president's lawyers at the time was Leonard Garment.
This was the show of the week, the month, the year, decade for young lawyers. Hello, young lawyers, wherever you are. And they were drawn by the excitement of the pursuit of the great white whale, all these Ahabs.
There was a constant pursuit by Congress and the press. It sometimes seemed the administration was coming unpinned. It looked that way in New Orleans when President Nixon shoved Press Secretary Ron Ziegler toward a horde of reporters.
And Nixon was trying every which way. How could he save his presidency? How could he pin it on somebody else? How could he rationalize what happened?
The Nixon White House was in, at least from the external and even from the journalist point of view, was in real shambles. They were paralyzed. I mean, they could do nothing but defend against Watergate.
And in the middle of all that, the country was subjected to further signs of collapse.
I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted.
In October of 1973, Vice President Agnew, the administration's top spokesman for law and order, did resign after he was charged with extortion, bribery, and tax evasion in a separate scandal all his own.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
But even as his allies were falling around him, the president was determined to finish his watch.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Imagine a president of the United States in a news conference on national television saying, I'm not a crook. You know, you never even before that ever conceived that a president might be a crook. It just all began to mount up, and ultimately it was a collapse.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions...
Finally, it was all too overwhelming, even for the toughest of battle-scarred politicians.
Each time. I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
You could never take the presidency quite as seriously again. It maybe was purgative. It kind of ended that particular unhappy decade to have Nixon resign and the rather blank but benign figure of Jerry Ford take over. His resignation was a relief, casting off of an old snakeskin, moving forward.
In April of 1975, 2 years after American combat troops had left Vietnam, North Vietnamese forces reached the outskirts of Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. An ally the United States had supported with men and material for nearly 2 decades was about to fall to the communists.
It's almost like we were never there now. And that's the tragedy of it, I think.
On April the 29th, there were still more than 1,000 American personnel in the city. They and 6,000 desperate South Vietnamese were helicoptered out as the last remnants of American power fled Saigon. Veteran Phil Caputo had returned to Vietnam as a reporter.
And the North Vietnamese were shelling Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Well, I remember some of those shells landing close to one. The building was just trembling. And somebody said, "Go, go, go." And I remember running out and just leaping in this big CH-53 helicopter, huge thing.
Come on, this way. Hey, this way, come on. Come on, let's go.
Must have been 60, 70, maybe 80 Vietnamese refugees and a few American newsmen, a handful of people from the embassy. And then the helicopter took off. I remember just looking down and just seeing this brown and green country. And then we crossed the coast. The sight I'll never forget. The 7th Fleet had mustered out there. They were going to take refugees out. I looked at all of this might, and I said, we got whipped by a bunch of peasant guerrillas in the end.
On the next day, victorious North Vietnamese troops rolled into Saigon.
At 10 o'clock in the morning, the radio announced that, the South Vietnamese had surrendered. And that was it, we hugged one another and cried, and for me, it's many long years, and now we see the final day.
I felt in a whole range of emotions. I mean, I felt sad, I felt regretful, I felt relieved that it was over. Maybe the one emotion I didn't feel was any sense of happiness or joy.
I felt a sense of loss. It stays with you forever. Vietnam will be there until the day I join the friends of mine who died before me. I think. It won't ever go away.
For America, the fall of Vietnam would symbolize the end of an era, the post-war era of confidence, unity, and optimism. America had found that there were some burdens too great to bear, and some prices too steep to pay. The fall of Vietnam was the nadir of a humiliating episode in American history. The desire to begin again, to recover some sense of national purpose, would drive American life through the remaining years of the 1970s. That's on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. And we hope you'll join us. I'm Peter Jennings.